All right, so we are about to start phase 1 of this course, finding your macro threshold. We're going to switch back to the Mighty Mike character. At this stage, had this been Diet or Diane, she's ready. She's gone through onboarding. She's ready to start phase 1. Big Bone Bob's going to start phase 1. So we'll basically just take everybody through phase 1 pretty similarly. But using the Mighty Mike character here, he's starting, if you remember, at 160 pounds. He's wanting to get to 150 pounds. And these are his starting macros, which we calculated earlier. So here we are in the phase 1 finding macro threshold sheet for Mighty Mike. The date has auto-populated to 1/1/2018. His weight has populated to 160. This is just an arbitrary number that kind of allows you to get a visual of the trend line as far as kind of how fast he should be potentially losing weight. Ketones, again, the blue is optional. You don't have to plug in ketones. You don't have to test for ketones, but if you do, feel free to populate those data points here. And same is true with cardio. Put in your cardio amounts as you take them just so you can kind of have a pulse on what you're doing there. Main thing here is the macros. So fats, proteins, carbs, those auto-populate to the numbers that we calculated. And all of these macro ratios have an associated pie chart to get a visual of the actual ratios. These are all populated to give you a guideline, but as you go through this and notice how you're feeling, you can adjust these kind of to fine-tune things for you as an individual. I recommend sticking with a set of macros a week at a time. I wouldn't advise you to change the macros midweek because that's not really going to be an adequate amount of time for your body to adjust to the macros. Each of these phases has a graph that shows what your macros are doing and then what your weight is doing as you populate it. Highly encourage you to populate the weight column here because as you do that, the graph below will give you a good visual of what direction you're trending. All right, so again, the primary goal of phase 1, finding your macro thresholds, is just that, finding what your protein threshold is and your fat threshold is. If you'll notice with these pre-populated numbers, the fat ratio starts pretty high and tapers down as we go. What's happening here is your fat is decreasing from 170 to 164 to 158 while your protein is increasing 87, 89, 92. And these numbers are going to be different for everybody. And you're going to notice, changes as you go, and those changes are going to be different for everybody. What you're looking for here with the increase in protein and the decrease in your fat ratio, do you notice yourself feeling more bloated? Do you notice yourself feeling more lethargic? Any digestive issues? A little bit of variation in your weight is going to be expected, but if you start dropping weight consistently and then all of a sudden you see a spike that plateaus, or you see that drop in weight kind of level off for a significant amount of time, that is a pretty good indicator that you've hit your protein threshold and that you'll need to move on to phase 2. Let's just run through some hypotheticals here. Let's say he's starting at 160. He follows the 170, 85, 10 for that week, and he's tracking his weight as he goes. He drops down to 158. Let's just say 157. So everything's trending downward. 155. So still feeling pretty good there. And he just continues to trend downward like this for quite a while. Let's just say about the 3rd or 4th week, though, he notices his weight just kind of stays consistently at 154. Maybe even peaks back up to 155 for a little while. And then just kind of stays there consistently. No matter what. No variation in his training. Everything else is held constant. He just notices his weight has plateaued. If you look at the graph, you can kind of see that. He's trending down, and then also he's just plateauing. That's a pretty good indicator that his protein threshold is right around 76.2%. So I would not advise increasing protein beyond that threshold ratio. If you find that you feel really, really good at, say, 77% for whatever reason, you just like ticking along, your mental cognition has improved, you feel great, that 77% might be your body's preferred fat ratio. That might be where you want to kind of exist throughout the entirety of this course. If that's the case, then you can just go on over to phase 2 and type in that preferred ratio. In phase 1, main point being finding your protein threshold. Once you start noticing some adverse effects from the increase in protein, the decrease in fat, that's a good indicator that you've hit your threshold. You need to move on to phase 2. So one thing that I've noticed amongst the majority of my clients, they tend to see some pretty good results around the 80% fat, especially if you've just started this course and you've automatically dropped down to 10 grams of carbs. You're going to get some pretty noticeable, benefits from that in itself. Generally speaking, my clients hit their threshold at around 76, 77%, sometimes 75. Quick little note here though. If your weight spikes, one day, that does not necessarily mean you've hit your threshold. Especially if you're, a female and you've, hit your cycle or hormones come into play, you might be, seeing an uptick in your weight at a higher fat ratio. That doesn't mean that you've hit your protein ratio. So I definitely encourage you to, stick with a set of macros and get consistent data, removing as many variables as possible before you determine your threshold and move on to the next phase.